Hopefully this works, because if it doesn't, I'm done. Alright, so let's get started. Let's talk about the 60s.
Okay, ready to work on this baby.
Alright, so the 60s, and like how old were you in 1962?
In 62, I was 15.
15. Alright. What differences in like teaching or in government have like really changed in our government, in our country?
Well, that's a great question. And to be quite honest with you, the teaching in the early 60s was much easier than it is the teachings in this particular century here, just because it is like really difficult, I think, for public teachers to actually teach a class dealing with all of the adversity that's going on in the classroom. Back in the 60s, there was a lot more discipline. A teacher could get out there and actually smack you. And they could discipline you. And if you got in trouble, you didn't want your mom and dad to know about it, because when they did, not only did you get disciplined in high school or that particular time, but you also got disciplined when you went home. I got in trouble once, and I'll tell you the story. It was pretty simple. We were in a classroom, and we played a practical joke on one of our classmates, and it wasn't really serious, but the teacher was pretty upset that we did this in the classroom. So he put us to the principal, and the principal took me into his office, and he said, "I have to call you Dad, let him know." And that's the last thing I wanted him to do, because I knew that meant instant death when I got home. And that's no lie. When I got home, my dad took me, and I touched 4 walls before I hit the floor again. So it was a lesson to be learned, but I love my dad, and the discipline factor is real important. I always noticed, like when parochial high school students came over to the public schools, that they were way ahead of us, primarily because the nuns were very disciplined, and they got a lot more material learned, and they were just much more aggressive in the teaching than in the public schools, because they could even be more so disciplined than in the public schools. Also during that time, I call the 60s an era of transition. Transition between, from the early 60s, drugs started infiltrating into the college scene, and then it also started getting down right in the mid-60s into the high school, particularly at that time it was just primarily marijuana. Then they got into PCP and a lot of the hard stuff, and hallucinogens that really created some really bad scenes and things going on like that. But for teaching-wise, teachers today don't get the credit they deserve, what they have to go through. And I really feel bad about that, but they should get a medal with some of the attitudes and the way that I think a lot of young people think. I think there are a lot of nice young people out there too. Don't get me wrong, I've had the chance to teach up in Cook County High. I've taught in Silver Bay, I've coached in both places, so it's been really exciting. But my feeling is that what happened is that civil rights has a purpose, and the rights of every individual is really important, and they adhere to them. But sometimes I believe they overstep their boundaries. The Supreme Court has made some rulings that really hurt, I think, public education. And there's one thing you want to think about: as soon as they started taking God out of public education started to deteriorate to a lower level. So I really feel that that was sad, but that did not happen in the 60s. God was pretty strong. What happened, I think, with a lot of students, because I went to college in '65, and I went to college out in South Dakota, in Aberdeen, to Northern State, and they're very conservative teaching college at that time, but very well ranked in football. So it's the reason I went out there. I loved football. And But I remember, it was really funny because I remember the second year there, these 4 students came in from New York City. And one was a football player, and then the other 3, I'm not sure what they were doing. But they lasted 2 months, and they were escorted out of the state by law enforcement because they were selling marijuana. South Dakota had no tolerance for drugs. It was just awesome to see that. When I went back home that summer, my friends were going to BC, BU, University of Massachusetts, and I'd go to these schools and they had these parties. There was one time I went to a party in Boston. My friend had, Greg, he was going to BU, and went to this party, and this particular girl I was sitting next to was smoking this joint. And the next thing you know, she thought she could fly. And she wanted to jump out the window, and we were 2 stories up, and she would have got hurt pretty bad. So we had all we could do, honestly, to restrain her. I felt at that time I was pretty strong. I was playing college ball and stuff. But this girl was really determined to go out that window and jump. She would have if we weren't there. Another good friend of mine who got a full scholarship to the University of New Hampshire. There's a mountain in New Hampshire, you may know it as a class, but it was Cannon Mountain, but on that mountain there was a face, and it's called the Old Man in the Mountain. It was granite carved into the face, and it's kind of like the picture of the state of New Hampshire. It's a granite state, and they had that picture on the license plate. And this kid was up there. He was doing drugs in Norman. Great football player. Jumped off that cliff and paralyzed from there on down the rest of his life. And those stories just go on and on with all the craziness going on during the 60s. Biggest disappointment is that our involvement in Vietnam. I'm not saying that, we had this issue going on with Soviet Union, very competitive. Started with the satellites, Sputnik and all, and being first in space and all that stuff. First one to the moon, that was important. And then we had the Cuban crisis with President Kennedy. Had to take a stand, and everybody was on edge because it was like toe-to-toe with the Russians, dealing with them bringing missiles into Cuba so that they would have a closer access to drop a missile on us if they wanted to at that time. During that time, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier there at the Soviet Union, was over, and I should say honestly, Nikita Khrushchev had a desire to go to Disneyland, Disney World maybe. Disney World wasn't there, but he wanted to go to Disneyland, and he really wanted to see that. And he seemed like a funny guy. But I remember seeing him as a teenager in TV, black and white, smashing his shoe on the podium saying, "We will bury you." And when he's doing this, he said it like 3 times, as far as I remember. And that scared me. And I was looking at that saying, wow. And then I found out later on in history what he meant is that we will outlast you because of their particular government, which is a dictatorship, and that democracy wouldn't last because it was too loose. We would just kill ourselves by doing all these other